I'd like to begin today with a warm-up. Here are 3 simple sentences about the civil rights movement. I would like you to combine the 3 simple sentences into a new complex sentence. It should have a dependent clause beginning with a conjunction and an independent clause. I've given you 4 conjunctions to choose from. I suggest you use the one that shows contrast to show different information, differing ideas. You should also include an appositive phrase, an extra piece of information. Here's a suggestion. Find the sentence with the linking verb and take the most important information from that and use that for your appositive. I would like you to please submit your answer on Microsoft Teams. I'll be checking it for a grade. I'll give you about 3 minutes here, but if you need more time, you're welcome to pause the video and turn it in when you're ready. Of course, you'll need to watch the video first. Good luck. Remember, we won't be checking your answers here. Let's do a brief review. Jim Crow started as a racist character in a minstrel show that was meant to make fun of African Americans in a cruel way, but it became a symbol for discrimination or unfair treatment and racial prejudice or the belief that white people are superior to others. Eventually it would lend or give its name to an entire era or time period and a set of laws called Jim Crow laws. Laws that enforced or created segregation. Where segregation was often once de facto, a custom, it had become the law, de jure segregation.
Robinson waits. Here comes the pitch. And there goes a line drive to left field. Swan is after it. He leaps. It's over his head against the wall. Here comes Gilliam scoring. Brooklyn wins. Jackie Robinson
Integration is the opposite, the reversal of segregation. It's sometimes called desegregation. I'll bet you understand that from your vast knowledge of morphemes. One of the great milestones in the struggle for integration was Jackie Robinson's entry to Major League Baseball. In 1947, many baseball fans and players welcomed Robinson. They supported his participation in MLB. On the one hand, many people also, on the other hand, opposed or went against integration or coming together in MLB. So, although many people opposed integration, many baseball fans and players supported integration in MLB. Two sides of the coin. They supported it, we could say, to use a pronoun. What did we infer about the process of integration in the United States? Although Jackie Robinson surely hit a great number of home runs in baseball and scored a great victory for integration, supporters of full integration had only reached, what was it? What was the first stage, the first step in baseball, to use our metaphor? Yeah, first base. Supporters of integration had only reached first base. After all, Robinson only helped to integrate one small part of American society, baseball. One where there were no de jure segregation laws. Integration was a slow process we saw, and it happened only one small step at a time. There were still segregated drinking fountains and hospitals and stores, and the most disturbing of all to me, segregated schools, which we saw were often dozens of miles away from where the families lived who went to those schools, and they often had poor supplies and were often at a great disadvantage compared to the segregated white schools. We've seen many milestones already in the civil rights movement. But in 1954, the next great phase, the next great stage in the struggle would begin. And just as had happened in 1896, it took place in Washington at the Supreme Court of the United States. It was the Brown versus Board decision that defeated the segregation laws strengthened by Plessy versus Ferguson. But remember, only in one place. The courts had ordered that schools, only schools, should be integrated. And it was just what the courts said. We're going to talk today about the next great obstacle that civil rights leaders would need to overcome. While there was a great triumph in the Brown versus Board decision, well, let's see where I'm going with that. And take a minute and reconsider our metaphor. We could see that baseball is a great way of thinking about the many steps in the civil rights movement itself. Here, our baseball field represents not an actual baseball field, but all of the United States, and the players here, represented by the wonderful Jackie Robinson, represent civil rights leaders in the struggle for integration, not just in baseball, but everywhere in the country. And of course, the opposing team is none other than the ugly Jim Crow team. The first step was overcoming de facto segregation, an old custom. Then unfair court decisions, illegal actions by the states, and finally the defeat of Jim Crow laws themselves. Here comes the pitch. Jackie Robinson slid into first base, making the first important victory for integration. He integrated MLB. While it's only a sport, it's not a school, it's not the law, it was something that was widely seen across the country. He became a very celebrated person, and people saw that in one of their favorite pastimes or activities, baseball, people could indeed come together. And eventually, despite the rocky beginnings, the threats and other things that he faced, Jackie Robinson would become widely celebrated across the country. This was an important first step. But it was only integration in one place. The next step was to slide into second base to defeat Plessy versus Ferguson. was a great victory when the Plessy decision was overturned. What did it? What brought about integration in schools? None other than the Brown versus Board of Education decision. All 9 justices or judges of the Supreme Court decided that separate was not equal. They ordered that schools become integrated. What can you infer about the process of integration from these 2 episodes, these 2 moments? Although the Brown versus Board of Education was a great victory for integration in the U.S. and showed the courts could help integration, supporters of full integration had only reached, yeah, that's right, second base. Integration, we see yet again, was a slow process, and it happened one small step at a time. This was the problem that emerged. Many states and individuals still refused to follow the court's orders. They illegally stood in the way of school integration. That's our subject for today. Take a quick stretch. The courts had ordered that schools become integrated. A second place, other than baseball, was now the stage for integration, the coming together of people, desegregation, the opposite, the reversing of Jim Crow segregation. It was a great achievement for the civil rights movement. But there were limits to what the Supreme Court could do, as we'll see today. We're going to look at the story of just one person. It might surprise you that she was only a little younger than you are now. It's the story of a little girl. Her name was Ruby Bridges. And as you'll see, she very quickly learned that even though the Supreme Court had spoken, places around the country were not yet ready to accept its orders. For several years, 6-year-old Ruby Bridges was accompanied or surrounded by special U.S. troops or marshals to protect her. You see, the people in her community opposed or stood against her entering school. She was only 6 years old. I want you to see first these primary sources before we read the story itself. Eventually, Ruby would score a great victory for the civil rights movement. But it's important to remember that she wasn't doing anything wrong. She was doing exactly what the courts had ordered, and yet faced great opposition and even threats to her life. Our Ruby taught us all a lot. She became someone who helped change our country. She was part of history, just like generals and presidents are part of history. They're leaders, and so was Ruby. She led us away from hate, and she led us nearer to knowing each other, the white folks and the black folks. Lucille Bridges, Ruby's mother. We're going to read the story of Ruby Bridges by Robert Coles. This tells the story of how states and regions within the country stood in the way of the court. Even though the Supreme Court had ordered that schools become integrated, states took illegal actions and ignored the courts. And eventually you'll see it wasn't just the states that stood in the way. Individual people, often overcome by powerful misguided emotions, stood in the way and angrily protested a little girl who was simply trying to go to school. As we listen to the story and as you read along with me, I would like you to take some notes. I've given you the terms in the packet. If you'd like, you could listen to the story and read along with me first and then go back and add the notes. Remember, notes aren't complete sentences. Use abbreviations and keep them short. I hope you enjoy this story. Before we do read it, though, I do want to give you one little note. Ruby Bridges was a deeply religious person as a child, so you'll hear a great deal in this story about her Christian faith. It's okay if you don't know anything about the Christian faith or share any of its beliefs. That's perfectly acceptable. What I would like you to do, however, is to think about what is behind her feelings, her religious feelings. I think it will be quite obvious. I think you'll learn something quite remarkable about this person. Ruby Bridges. I hope you enjoy the story. Ruby Bridges was born in a small cabin near Tylertown, Mississippi. "We were very poor, very, very poor," Ruby said. "My daddy worked picking crops. We just barely got by. There were times when we didn't have much to eat. The people who owned the land were bringing in machines to pick the crops, so my daddy lost his job, and that's when we had to move. I remember us leaving. I was 4, I think." In 1957, the family moved to New Orleans. Ruby's father became a janitor. Her mother took care of the children during the day. After they were tucked in bed, Ruby's mother went to work scrubbing floors in a bank. Every Sunday, the family went to church. "We wanted our children to be near God's Spirit," Ruby's mother said. "We wanted them to start feeling close to Him from the very start." At that time, black children and white children went to separate schools in New Orleans. The black children were not able to receive the same education as white children. It wasn't fair, and it was against the nation's law. In 1960, a judge ordered 4 black girls to go to 2 white elementary schools. 3 of the girls were sent to McDonough 19. 6-year-old Ruby Bridges was sent to 1st grade in the William Frantz Elementary School. Ruby's parents were proud that their daughter had been chosen to take part in an important event in American history. They went to church. "We sat there and prayed to God," Ruby's mother said, "that we'd all be strong and we'd have courage and we'd get through any trouble. And Ruby would be a good girl and she'd hold her head up high and be a credit to her own people and a credit to all the American people. We prayed long and we prayed hard." On Ruby's first day, a large crowd of angry white people gathered outside the Frantz Elementary School. The people carried signs that said they didn't want black children in a white school. People called Ruby names. Some wanted to hurt her. The city and state police did not help Ruby. The President of the United States ordered federal marshals to walk with Ruby into the school building. The marshals carried guns. Every day for weeks that turned into months, Ruby experienced that kind of school day. She walked to the front school surrounded by marshals. Wearing a clean dress and a bow in her hair and carrying her lunch pail, Ruby walked slowly for the first few blocks. As Ruby approached the school, she saw a crowd of people marching up and down the street. Men and women and children shouted at her. They pushed toward her. The marshals kept them from Ruby by threatening to arrest them. Ruby would hurry through the crowd and not say a word. The white people in the neighborhood would not send their children to school. When Ruby got inside the building, she was all alone, except for her teacher, Mrs. Henry. There were no other children to keep Ruby company, to play with and learn with, to eat lunch with. But every day, Ruby went into the classroom with a big smile on her face, ready to get down to the business of learning. She was polite and she worked well at her desk, Mrs. Henry said. She enjoyed her time there. She didn't seem nervous or anxious or irritable or scared. She seemed as normal and relaxed as any child I've ever taught. So Ruby began learning how to read and write in an empty classroom, an empty building. Sometimes I'd look at her and wonder how she did it, said Mrs. Henry. How she went by those mobs and sat here all by herself and yet seemed so relaxed and comfortable. Mrs. Henry would question Ruby in order to find out if the girl was really nervous and afraid, even though she seemed so calm and confident. But Ruby kept saying she was doing fine. The teacher decided to wait and see if Ruby would keep on being so relaxed and hopeful, or if she'd gradually begin to wear down, or even decide that she no longer wanted to go to school. Then one morning, something happened. Mrs. Henry stood by a window in her classroom as she usually did, watching Ruby walk toward the school. Suddenly, Ruby stopped, right in front of the mob of howling and screaming people. She stood there facing all those men and women. She seemed to be talking to them. Mrs. Henry saw Ruby's lips moving and wondered what Ruby could be saying. The crowd seemed ready to kill her. The marshals were frightened. They tried to persuade Ruby to move along. They tried to hurry her into the school, but Ruby wouldn't budge. Then Ruby stopped talking and walked into the school. When she went into the classroom, Mrs. Henry asked her what had happened. Mrs. Henry told Ruby that she'd been watching and that she was surprised when Ruby stopped and talked with the people in the mob. Ruby became irritated. "I didn't stop and talk with them," she said. "Ruby, I saw you talking," Mrs. Henry said. "I saw your lips moving." "I wasn't talking," said Ruby. I was praying. I was praying for them." Every morning, Ruby had stopped a few blocks away from school to say a prayer for the people who hated her. This morning, she forgot until she was already in the middle of the angry mob. When school was over for the day, Ruby hurried through the mob as usual. After she walked a few blocks and the crowd was behind her, Ruby said the prayer she repeated twice a day, before and after school. "Please, God, try to forgive those people, because even if they say those bad things, they don't know what they're doing. So you could forgive them, just like you did those folks a long time ago when they said terrible things about you." Afterward, later that year, 2 white boys joined Ruby at the France Elementary School. Their parents were tired of seeing the boys get into mischief around the house when they could have been in school and learning. The mob became very angry when the first white students went back to school, but those boys were soon joined by other children. "We've been sitting back and letting our children get cheated out of an education because some people have tried to take the law into their own hands," one parent said. "It's time for us to fight for the side of the law and for our children's rights to go to school and get their education." They all did get their education, Ruby and a growing number of boys and girls who went to the school with her. By the time Ruby was in the 2nd grade, the mobs had given up their struggle to scare Ruby and defeat the federal judge's orders that New Orleans schools be desegregated so that children of all races might be in the same classroom. Year after year, Ruby went to the Front School. She graduated from it, then went on to graduate from high school. Ruby Bridges is married to a building contractor and has 4 sons. Now a successful businesswoman, she has created the Ruby Bridges Educational Foundation. With its focus on education, community, and the future of our nation's children, the foundation is especially dedicated to revitalizing the William Front School, which is located in the heart of the 9th Ward in New Orleans. Ruby is once again stepping to the forefront and embracing an opportunity to make history by contributing to the challenge that our nation is facing in the recovery efforts following Hurricane Katrina. There's also a special exhibit featuring Ruby's story at the Children's Museum of Indianapolis in Indianapolis, Indiana, called The Power of Children, Making a Difference. I hope you enjoyed the story of Ruby Bridges. I appreciate how Robert Coles used concise language to capture the powerful emotions that Ruby experienced in those difficult days. I especially like the charming illustrations. There is one thing, however, that I feel it's very important that I remind you of. The story of Ruby Bridges is a true one. This is non-fiction. We can see in photographs of the time of 1960 that these were real events. Here's Ruby descending or walking down the steps of the school on her way home. Who's that surrounding her? Do you recognize them? Look at their armbands. These are U.S. Marshals. They're a special kind of police officer. They were sent by the federal or national government, represented by the President of the United States. They were there to protect Ruby, because the police of New Orleans and the state police of Louisiana would not protect her. And as you know, Ruby was being threatened. This is a photograph also from 1960, and these are the protesters who stood out, who lined the blocks on the way to the school to protest Ruby. She might have seen these people with her very own eyes. They also brought along their children, by the way. Students not much older and sometimes even younger than Ruby was. These protesters knew that they were speaking out against and threatening a very young person. At one point, they made an especially powerful and hateful message. I'd like you to see it. At several points, protesters brought tiny little coffins, and in the coffins they placed dolls with black skin. I think you can see what the protesters were trying to say. They wished harm on Ruby. You might say they wished her dead. At least that was the message that they wanted her to see. What is especially confusing about this image is the expression on the people's faces. I'd like you to look at the woman in the front of the picture in particular. These are not the faces that one would wear in going to a funeral or for mourning or feeling deep sadness on the passing of another human being. These people almost appear to be celebrating. How is that? What a strange thing. Now, it's not clear that these people would have taken any physical action against Ruby, but they did want to scare her, and they did want her to make her feel unloved for her actions, for her choice to go to school, to follow the orders of the court. What are we to make of these people? How should we feel about them? If you've been listening closely to me over the past few weeks, I think you have an idea. I think you know how we might answer this question. Are these bad people? I think you know by now that I don't think so. Let me explain. One thing that I've learned from studying the civil rights movement, and one thing I hope that you've learned from studying Ruby Bridges herself, think about her prayer. Think about the powerful forgiveness that she asked for people who harmed her. One thing that I've learned, that I hope you'll understand as well, is that we shouldn't let single actions define our entire lives. I don't know anything about these people except that they were acting in a very bad way. They were acting in a way that is unacceptable. They were inflicting, I think, great damage on a young person. I don't think anyone deserves to experience or endure or go through what Ruby Bridges had to. Now, I'd like to think that the women in these pictures on the left, for instance, and the young man that came along with them, have since realized how terrible their actions were. I don't know the answer to that question. What I do know is that in this moment, in the moment captured in these photographs, these primary sources, these people made a terrible error. And for over a year, that error was repeated. And yet, you saw in Ruby Bridges' story, she wished them no harm, and even wished to forgive them. I think this is a powerful lesson. You'll be relieved to hear that we've come a long way from those days of 1960. Who's that in the picture? Well, that's Ruby Bridges many years later. It might surprise you to know that Ruby Bridges is still alive. She's actually only in her late 60s. I think you could do the math if she was 6 years old in 1960 when she went to the school in New Orleans. Do you recognize that woman on the left? That's Mrs. Henry, Barbara Henry. Ruby Bridges and Barbara Henry, her teacher, remained friends for many years. She, too, is still alive. She's 88 years old. Here is Ruby and Barbara many years later. They appeared at an anniversary or an event celebrating the integration of that New Orleans school. They've gone on to do television interviews and many public events to help promote civil rights and the feeling of unity and forgiveness among people. I hope you enjoyed this story. It's a powerful lesson. If you haven't done so, I'd like you to go back and take a few brief notes based on the terms that I've given you in the packet. If you stick around, I'll have 2 more videos for you here in this video, 2 more other videos attached to it. You'll see a moment where Ruby Bridges discusses her life story for a television documentary, and then a second clip in which she revisited her experience with one of the white classmates who eventually joined her at the school in New Orleans. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll continue our discussion next week.
In this great future, you can't forget your past. So dry your tears, I say, until my peeps who passed away. No woman.
I was one of 4 6-year-old children, girls, to integrate the public school system here in New Orleans in 1960. Well, being 6 and not really understanding what was going on at the time during the Civil Rights Movement, my parents didn't explain anything to me. I always say to people that it would be really, really hard to explain to a 6-year-old child what I was about to encounter going to school that day. So the only thing that they said to me is that you are going to go to a new school and you better behave. I was, I believe, 17 or 18 years old when I was asked to do an interview, and the reporter showed me a copy of the Norman Rockwell painting. Even though I was accustomed to looking at old magazines and Eyes on the Prize and seeing all that footage, I understood that it was important, but it didn't really hit me until I saw the Norman Rockwell painting. It was a lesson that Dr. King tried to teach all of us. And that was that we should never look at a person and judge them by the color of their skin. That is the lesson that I learned in that classroom at 6 years old, simply because I crossed a picket line, a mob every day for a whole year. They were all white, screaming, yelling, threatening to harm me. And yet every day when I entered the building, there was a woman there to greet me, and she was also white. And I remember not really knowing what to expect from her, if she was going to be exactly like the people outside. But she did everything she could to make my day filled with fun. And I loved learning.
In this great future, you can't forget your past. So dry your tears, I say.
3811 Galvez Street. Another empty building ravaged by Katrina, but spared the wrecking ball. Because 50 years ago, history whistled through these windows.
A token break in the color line. A New Orleans girl goes to school.
Now 56, the memories flow easily for Ruby Bridges, the little girl who integrated William Frantz School, protected by a team of federal marshals.
There was lots of people outside, and they were screaming and shouting, and the police officers, but I thought it was Mardi Gras, you know? I didn't actually know that all of that was there because of me.
Her parents were committed to challenging Jim Crow laws and made the uneasy decision of sending their child daily into the teeth of a hate-filled crowd.
There were days when they would come and they would bring a baby's coffin. And inside this baby's coffin was a black doll. And I used to have nightmares about the coffin.
We don't want the niggas going in that school.
Resistance was ugly, and downtown protests turned violent. White parents scurried to take their children out of the newly integrated schools.
And they went into every classroom and they pulled out every child.
But the next day, one family took a stand.
Simply want the privilege of taking my child to school.
34-year-old Methodist minister Lloyd Foreman was the first to crack that school boycott. He took his 5-year-old daughter Pam and, without federal protection, walked right through that same angry mob.
Why don't you move in a college quarter?
Days later, a handful of other parents followed Foreman's lead, and the protest began to fade.
Hello.
Now, for the first time in 50 years,
How are you?
Ruby and Pam reunited at Frantz School.
Daddy always called it the longest walk.
Really?
Because in my case, our own white race was against us. I mean, we had bomb threats. We had to move out of the house. It was terrible.
Why do you think your father stood his ground in face of all of that?
Because of his faith in God and his beliefs, that every child, regardless of their race, deserved a right to an education.
Is that your father?
Yeah, that's Daddy.
Reliving their separate but equally painful memories. Pam's father died in 2005.
It makes me wonder.
I know, huh?
The two former schoolmates say times have changed, but the issue remains. By the 1980s, Frantz had become nearly all black. Ruby hopes the school can one day live up to its legacy.
I entered this building to integrate the school. If we are going to get past our racial differences, it's going to come from our kids, but they have to be together to do that.
Michelle Miller, CBS News, New Orleans.